the road to Palenque is dangerous. People get pulled out of their vehicles, they get stripped, like their clothes get ripped off of them. They're taking off the man's clothes. People's cars being commandeered.
And you send help for us.
To include tour buses. People driving to Palenque literally pray that the worst that happens to them is that they go through a blockade and have to pay a little bit of cash. Like that, they hope for that. They hope for that. So today we're going to talk about the two main concerns we have when it comes to traveling to Palenque and whether I think those two factors are worth what you get in the end. But really quickly, anytime you talk about risks, there's two factors that you always want to take into consideration, and one is the severity, meaning if that happens, how much are you gonna hate it? And the second is probability. How likely is it to actually happen? And in today's video, one of those things are a high probability, moderate to maybe low severity, while the other one is a low probability with a very high potential that you're gonna wanna avoid it. But first, what even is Palenque?
Palenque!
Palenque.
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 It's one of 4 Pueblo Mágicos here in Chiapas, Mexico. Palenque was a major Mayan city that perished in the 8th century, and it really wasn't that long ago that it was discovered at all. To date, only 2% of this massive city has actually been uncovered, with the other 98% needing to still be excavated. And the most famous ruler of Palenque was the Mayan king Pakal, sometimes called Pakal the Great, who was initially thought to be an alien because early archaeologists, when they found his tomb, the first cover on the tomb, which kind of told his story, was interpreted incorrectly, and so they thought it was a depiction of Pakal like in a spaceship. But really, they were just looking at the picture from the wrong vantage point. Anyway, now one of the great bonuses of Palenque is you are able to climb some of the ruins, which it's one of those back and forth things, right? Like, yes, anything a tourist touches will eventually get ruined, but interacting with something is how we learn and how we can appreciate it. At the end of the day, a place where I'm allowed to touch and interact with things is always going to be much more memorable and ultimately worth it, especially if you're traveling with kids.
That was the easiest climb I've ever done in my life.
Says the 13-year-old punk.
But the best part of visiting Palenque, honestly, is not Palenque itself, but being able to visit at least one of the amazing waterfalls that are nearby. Now, nearby might mean 2 hours away, so take that with a grain of salt. But Palenque is hot, even in February, and so it would be the biggest crime to visit Palenque and then not visit a waterfall shortly after.
Perfect. After this hot day in Palenque, highly recommend coming here.
This is the best part of the tour thing so far.
Is it cold? Yes.
But of course, to enjoy Palenque, you must first go to Palenque, and that requires some awareness. I do want to clarify that I am specifically speaking of visiting Palenque from San Cristobal, which is the closest major city. It's approximately a 6-hour drive. Now, people do visit Palenque also from Tulum and Playa del Carmen and other places. The drive from those places are significantly longer. However, they might not be as treacherous. So Palenque is situated in the state of Chiapas, which is also where I currently live. It's on the northeastern portion of the Chiapas, not too far from the nearby state of Tabasco, and a few hours drive away from the northern portion of Guatemala. And this region is hot. It is a jungle, tropical kind of environment. Really reminded me of Merida, except much more green, and you've got amazing mountains to look at. Now, I don't know if you can tell by looking at Google Maps, but let's go over problem number 1. The high probability and moderate severity of getting car sick. I went with a group of 6, 7 if you include the driver, and half of us got sick. Now, one of them might have gotten sick less from car sickness and maybe more because she got dehydrated / very hot while visiting Palenque. And so this is a trip you want to take when you are feeling your best and you're not under the weather at all.
Holy windy road.
The twists and the turns have just been non-stop.
Yes.
Being nauseous definitely crossed my mind a couple of times, and Alex had no effects whatsoever when it came to nausea. He was completely fine the entire time. And I am super grateful that none of us had like sympathetic stomachs, you know, where you see one person throw up and then before you know it, everyone's throwing up. Because that would have been awful. But nausea aside, the trip was beautiful. We started off with similar mountain ranges to San Cris, so beautiful mountains, mist, very green. But by the time we got to Palenque, still mountains, but the green was much more palmy. So it was a really nice but kind of subtle change of scenery. Also, we got to see both the sunrise and the sunset because the trip started at 4 in the morning and we did not get home till well after dark. Now, generally speaking, I would consider car sickness to be not that big of a deal. There's lots of ways to help that situation out, but on the road to Palenque, some of those methods that you might use to deal with car sickness are taken away from you. So one, we chose to get a private driver to take us to Palenque, which was an amazing decision because a private driver has more flexibility, right? If you're on a bus tour with lots of people, sometimes it's harder for the driver to accommodate every little need that all the different passengers might want, right? However, when it comes to traveling too, again, aside from the ride itself was more comfortable and being sick amongst friends is a lot more comfortable than being sick amongst strangers. But two things that I would recommend that you do when you're car sick, you could not do on this tour because one, the tour guides, the drivers, will not stop under any circumstances except in the final destination or Oxchuc, which is kind of like the midpoint, and so that's considered a safe place to stop, have a meal, as well as refueling on gas. So Oxchuc is about 2.5 hours away from San Cris, and so for those 2.5 hours, the car is not gonna stop. It does not matter if you have to go to the bathroom, if you have to throw up, whatever your circumstance is, the driver is not allowed to stop, and the drivers tend to go in caravans when possible, and so another driver is going to rat out my driver if he decides to stop, and so he better have a reason that his boss thinks is acceptable. There are physical reasons, physical risks, why even if he wasn't told he couldn't stop, why he might not want to stop. So yeah, being car sick in a vehicle where nobody's willing to stop sucks because you can't take a break, right? Sometimes getting out of the car, stretching your legs, taking a breath of fresh air and not being in motion is what helps you get over car sickness, but this is not something that was possible in this ride. And of course, if you've got multiple people sick in a car, the best place to sit in the car is either the driver's seat or the front passenger seat, and only one person can sit in that passenger seat at a time. So again, some of the things you might do to mitigate getting car sick just was not possible for us. There were several spots in which the driver told us to roll up the windows because, again, for safety purposes, he didn't want anyone to easily be able to see inside. Because of course, another way to overcome car sickness is to get some fresh air, some circulation, and open the windows. Most of the time we were able to keep the windows cracked or open, but there were a couple moments. There were stretches where we were told, roll those windows up. Possibly if you're in a bus or something taller, maybe the window part wouldn't have been an issue, but we were in a car. So we were low to the ground and definitely lots of vendors, and one non-vendor came to our windows to try to see what was happening. And so all of those things makes being car sick for a 6-hour drive much worse than a normal car sickness scenario might be. Because yes, I might have gotten thrown up on. We don't talk about that. I'm also glad nobody was a smoker, because that could have also been uncomfortable. But let's talk about the second problem of not being able to stop whenever you want to, even if you need to toss your cookies, because why would that be? So we're gonna just cover all of the second part with a blanket. I don't fully understand. Chiapas has such a long history that it would take me at least a decade just to feel even slightly qualified to go into the nitty-gritty of all the reasons why it's unsafe to stop your car wherever you feel like it in certain parts of Chiapas. Like, we're just gonna start with there. Ultimately, I don't know. But here are some curious things I've noticed in the past little over a year and a half that I've been living in San Cris. One of the cool things about Chiapas and why the vibe is so different here than in many other parts of Mexico is Chiapas is still very much an autonomous state. And what I mean by that is Chiapas is filled with over 100 municipalities, 100 cities, although most of them are closer to maybe like a town or a village. And those municipalities really fight for their independence. They fight for their right to maintain the cultures that they've always had and or prefer. And a lot of those cultures and habits really tend to conflict with the more kind of the Mexican government as a whole. I mean, this is the home of the Zapatista movement. This is the home of a lot of indigenous communities, if you will, fighting for the things that they believe in. Again, I can't speak very specifically on what those individual things might be. Just suffice it to say that when I hear little bits about the different cultures around us, because again, they're not all the same, there are, of course, many human similarities, but also a lot of cultural differences. So there's always a little bit of an aggression or a conflict between the things that different municipalities or cities perceive the Mexican government as doing. Slight conflict kind of going on all the time. Now, one of the things the locals here in Chiapas seem to enjoy in order to voice their difference of opinion with the government are blockades. Now, sometimes these blockades are full blockades where nobody gets through, but oftentimes they are paid blockades where you pay a certain amount and then they'll allow you to go through.
Roadblocks on this route are actually a really big problem. Make sure to bring some cash for donations if you go this route.
Usually it's in the 50 peso range, although lately I'm hearing it's closer to the 200 peso range, which is considered very expensive by local standards. And because many parts of the Chiapas has no reception, it feels like these blockades are happening like suddenly, we don't get noticed, but it could also be that sometimes there's no way to notify us. And generally speaking, these blockades are mild, meaning there's no violence involved. It's just taking up some of your time, anxiety, and a little bit of your money, but nobody necessarily gets hurt, except when they do. One such blockade happened last year where a Russian couple was traveling through a blockade in Oxchuc, might be how you pronounce it. This is a city a little bit before you get to Ocosinco. I'm still not sure if it's because they wouldn't pay the blockade toll, or maybe they couldn't pay enough, or maybe they couldn't pay the blockade toll. I'm not 100% sure, but this couple was dragged out of the car, and something you'll notice, because there's definitely enough members of the blockade where these two could have been hurt. But at least in this video, instead of directly kind of attacking them, like assaulting them, you'll notice that they're taking off the man's clothes. Like, they're stripping him bare. And this is something I see kind of frequently where somebody who is perceived as a criminal, okay, so in this case, somebody trying to pass a blockade without paying could be perceived as the criminal, like the Russians might be considered the criminals from their perspective. One of the things they will do as a punishment or early kind of conflict management is to take off their clothes. But again, dragged out of the car, possibly not understanding what people are yelling at you for, having your clothes stripped off is probably a terrifying thing to have happened. This is one such example of how somebody is treated who commits a crime. Again, the Russian couple may not have considered themselves to have been the criminals in this case, but we've got different perceptions, right? The person recording this, by the way, is very secretive. Like they want to record, but they don't want to record because they do not want to get caught recording. So that's also an interesting thing. Literally a year ago, June 12th, 2022, there was a caravan going through, a tour caravan, going to Palenque, and on their way home, coming back to San Cris, in this same municipality, they got stopped. The locals forced everyone in the tour to basically ask the government for help. We can hear there are some English speakers who are prompted on what to say, and they're perfectly willing to say these things. You can also hear and see children in this video.
Sí, pues lo mismo que nos manden apoyo para poder llegar a San Cristóbal y poder pasar.
Le pedimos al gobierno que interceda y lleguen a un acuerdo con la gente que nos tiene aquí retenida.
Comentarios, yo lees en inglés para que sepa.
Can you do some commentary for the government?
What do I have to say?
Help? We need to translate it. Yeah, something like we need help.
Okay, we need
or
help,
something.
or we need to go to San Cristobal. I don't know what else to say.
That's okay. Some commentaries for the government and send help for us.
Yeah, please, can you send help for us so we can go to San Cristobal?
Yeah.
But what you don't see is that after they asked for help, the tourists were asked to leave the van because the vans got commandeered. So all the guests had to exit the van. They were abandoned on the side of the streets while the vans were taken. Again, area with no reception, so they couldn't easily call for help. It's late at night, it was January, so it probably got fairly cold that night. Again, probably not cold enough to kill anyone, but just very, very uncomfortable. Once there was daylight, the tour company that this group was on did send a fleet of vehicles to pick them up, so ultimately they were okay.
Pues misión cumplida.
But yeah, I'm sure it was a very frightening experience to deal with during the moment. More frequently, we do hear of people just, again, blockades happening and people demanding money. And of course, most people pay that willingly and move on. But these visuals are moments where you have to ask yourself, is the drive to Palenque worth it? For me, last year is when I was thinking about going to Palenque. Instead of going to Palenque, I chose to go to El Chiflón and other locations. Why risk that? I'm traveling with my son, my friends are traveling with their kids, and I'm confident none of them want their clothes ripped off of them. I'm confident none of them want to spend any amount of time on the side of the road in the dark, not knowing what's about to happen next. And so last year when all of this was happening, it just seemed like a really silly decision, which is why we waited until this year, after it's been quiet for a significant amount of time, to make our voyage to Palenque. So I do think while these events are much less likely to occur, the risk is probably not worth it. So definitely before visiting Palenque, ask those questions. One of the things I will say that happened after these two incidents last year, especially when the vehicles got taken, is tour guides, instead of going through this city, they diverted around it. And so the trip to Palenque therefore got longer and again more treacherous, because that initial route that we normally go through is also, believe it or not, a smoother ride than going on one of the alternative locations. Faster and smoother. And if we take into consideration getting nauseous, we can understand why late last year people started to once again traverse through that same town. Now seems to be peaceful, everything seems to be good, but I don't know what will trigger another incident. So before going to Palenque, these are questions you'll want to ask. When was the last time anything major happened? And make sure that it was, not last week. So I've known for a while that this region before hitting Ocosinco was kind of the dangerous region. I did not realize that Palenque itself or the nearby kind of municipalities would also be considered dangerous. So the other day going through this region, we had no issues whatsoever, no blockades, nothing. But as we were in Palenque and kind of the nearby region, going to Agua Azul, etc., that was the region where we were told, roll up your windows, don't engage with anyone selling anything, let the driver handle everything, because these are the people that are most likely to rob us.
Why did he say to keep the windows closed?
So they don't see if we have bags and stuff like that, because the people are local of the area and we're traveling alone. So to me, it sounds like if they see something they want, they might try to
grab it. Yeah. And also to note, Palenque, as well as I believe all the waterfalls, all close at 5 p.m. because this region is considered dangerous once it gets dark. Primarily because you're probably going to get robbed, but in the process of being mugged, other things can happen. And so Palenque, as well as these waterfalls, all close at 5 p.m. All tours start returning home at 5 p.m. because they do not want to risk being in the city after dark. So just information to have. Now, if you do decide to spend the night in Palenque, which I don't think is a bad idea at all, it's just a scenario where once it gets dark, you stay on the resort property or in your hotel room and you don't go sightseeing necessarily around the town. And so probably the only thing you'll have to plan ahead for is just making sure that the resort you're at has dinner available and or you bring your own food so that you have something to eat while you're in the hotel room. So I think the tour guides are doing their absolute best to make sure that we're safe, we're protected, everything is good. So definitely have a tour guide, have a driver, and follow their very wise advice. So yeah, I think Chiapas is an amazing state. It's an amazing place to live, but it's also a very diverse location. Definitely the most diverse place that I think I've ever lived. And being aware that your definition of violent or your definition of wrong may not be the same as a different culture's definition of violent or wrong. And I'll say, just generally speaking, if you're an American like myself, our definition is probably a lot more sensitive than the locals' definition. And it's good to keep that in mind. Because again, probability of all this happening is very low, except winter of 2022 and, probably during the Zapatista movement. But if it were to happen to you, how big of a deal would you think it is to be stuck on the side of the road, whether you have clothes or not? Finally, would I ultimately recommend visiting Palenque? Well, at the end of the day, it is not such an important place that if you tend to get easily car sick or nauseous, if you have mobility issues, or any reason why being in a vehicle for 3 to 6 hours is a problem, if any of these things are a concern to you, then I would say Palenque is not worth going to. Remember that when it comes to visiting ruins, waterfalls, all of those things, mobility is an issue. We're talking lots of steps, possibly muddy areas. But if you're otherwise fit, if you're not prone to nausea, if you got good legs, and if you're up for an adventure, then I would say it's worth it. But Alex would say,
not worth it.
But if I had to do it all over again, I would definitely spend the extra money and time to get a hotel room, probably at one of the more resorty type places, so I can spend honestly more time at the waterfalls. At the end of the day, ruins are a learning adventure. There's history, there's so much knowledge, and crazy amounts of beauty. But at least the ones I've been to have all been in very hot regions, and so the waterfalls is what makes it worthwhile, 100%.